While mostly positive, there have been many opinions on how director Christopher Nolan chose to end his adaptation of The Odyssey. If you've read the epic poem by Homer, you'll know two things. One is that it's quite different from what happens in the final 2 episodes of the poem. The other is that many people were already quite mixed on the poem's ending, meaning that there was a lot of room to make changes come the ending of this film. Nolan did do that with his adaptation, and in his new interview with Time magazine, he gives us a bit more detail surrounding the changes he made. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing what the director said about his adaptation of the film's ending and discussing what I think towards his comments. He also talked about some of the other aspects surrounding the film in that same interview, so I will be noting what else he said. Before I get into it though, if you want to keep up to date on any of my upcoming content surrounding the work of Christopher Nolan, then don't forget to support this upload by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. But without further ado, let's dive into Christopher Nolan's new interview about the ending of The Odyssey. So Christopher Nolan has just done an interview with Time magazine, and in that article he discussed the ending, and in particular why he decided to give Odysseus and Penelope the ending they don't get in Homer's epic poem. In talking about the ending, he further talked about surprising parallels between the Odyssey and Oppenheimer, and how to interpret Zendaya's Athena. And on top of this, he also went into the use of Zeus's lore in the film, and the deeper meaning behind Helen of Troy's scarred face. Starting with the interview segment about the ending though, Eliana Doctorman of Time magazine said to Nolan, "Odysseus is a man who suffers from PTSD, and in your interpretation, who believes he's responsible for the end of a civilization because he violated the ethical code by which the ancient Greeks lived their lives." Christopher Nolan replied to this by saying, "My form of storytelling is, you take a hero, as we did with Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer has all of these flaws, all of these complexities. You find an actor who can take the audience on a journey with that character and make mistakes with that character and not judge that character. And then you step back from that character and go, well, how did we get here? For this movie, you do that through Odysseus's men. That's one of the things in the poem that's breezed over, in the way in which the crew ends up getting killed one by one despite his leadership. In the process of adaptation, you go, that's actually pretty interesting. Maybe we need to make that more center stage. What's the relationship between him and his crew? How do they feel about how he's leading them and the things that befall them? He's a guy who makes a lot of mistakes, and his ultimate mistake is the Trojan horse. So there's a sort of tragic flaw right from the beginning in our telling of this story." Time magazine then went further into the comparisons to Oppenheimer by saying to him, "I was struck by the parallels between Oppenheimer and Odysseus, 2 brilliant men who create a tool of devastating destruction and then struggle with the guilt of what they have done. When I spoke to Matt Damon, I asked, what did you think when you first read the script? And he said it felt like Oppenheimer. I assumed that was a conscious choice." Nolan then replied to this by saying, "Yes, if I've done a film right, it leaves me with questions. It leaves me with things that I want to keep exploring and thinking about." And Oppenheimer fed very much into my reading of the story of Odysseus. John Leguizamo's Eumaeus says it at the very beginning, saying, "That's very clever, but your cleverness will get you in trouble." This is where it ties into Oppenheimer, as just because you can doesn't mean you should. The parallels were pretty apparent to me as I figured out how to adapt it. He then ended his discussion about the ending by talking about his choices surrounding Odysseus and Penelope. He said, well, it is the fall of civilization, so there is a fairly bleak sensibility. The end is talking about cycles, and you can view cycles pessimistically in that history is doomed to repeat itself. But there is also something optimistic about those cycles. As Penelope says in the film, civilization will rise again. There is rebirth and regrowth. For me, it was important in looking at the ending to try and strike the right balance between pessimism and optimism. Pessimism about what might have precipitated the Bronze Age catastrophe, and then optimism in that positive things will reassert themselves. So in what Nolan said here about his ending of The Odyssey, it goes in line with what I was saying in my biggest questions video for the film, in that the dialogue spoken between Odysseus and Penelope in the final scene displays both an optimistic and pessimistic stance. Odysseus' final words include him expressing his hope for civilization to rise again, that dawn will return, and that humanity's mistakes will eventually fade as they will be forgotten. So it reminds us of Odysseus' violent past and the weight he continues to carry. But unlike the bleak ending words from Oppenheimer in that Nolan film, Odysseus' departure has a small sense of hope. By removing himself from Ithaca, he gives his people the space to heal, and he attempts to heal himself. The director has essentially taken the position that the people who messed up should move out of the way and give the future generation a chance to make things right. And that is symbolized through Odysseus leaving and then Telemachus taking the throne. In one of Odysseus' final lines in the film, he specifically says, "And dawn will break over the darkened world, and our mistakes will once again be forgotten." Notice the use of the phrase "once again," suggesting a repetition of mistakes and problems that humanity has caused. It's Odysseus realizing the cycles of violence, as Nolan touched on in his interview, but he's ultimately choosing to embrace a path of hope. Moving on, the director was also asked about some of the other aspects of the film, and the first was about Zeus's lore. Time magazine said to the director, "The movie hinges on this idea that by creating the Trojan horse, Odysseus destroys Zeus's lore. That's the movie's term for the ancient Greek concept of xenia, the respectful relationship between host and guest, which can be tricky to explain to a modern audience. Why was it important to include?" Nolan replied to this, "When you find these things that are difficult to deal with, sometimes the solution is to just dive in and make it everything. I didn't use the term xenia because you don't want to throw too many terms at people, but it's essentially the golden rule. It all comes back to weather and to geography. When you leave the house, you are depending on the kindness of strangers, and you have to trust that when you arrive somewhere, after weeks or months of travelling, that you will be fed, you will be given water. 3,000 years ago, that was everything. You were always at the mercy of strangers." And so this idea that a stranger could be a god in disguise is very powerful as the underpinning of a belief system. Time magazine then talked about the Athena reveal in the film, saying to Nolan, "My interpretation of Zendaya's character is that she is not Athena as Odysseus initially presents her. Essentially, gods don't exist in this world but are a manifestation of his guilt. During the sack of Troy, we see her as a priestess in the temple of Athena, and the Greeks behead her. For Odysseus, she encapsulates the chaos that the horse has wrought on the world. But my editor did not interpret it that way, so I am hoping you will settle our disagreement." Nolan replied to this interesting point of debate by saying, "I couldn't possibly answer that because I learned very early on with my film Memento that it's unfair to define the experience for the audience by answering questions like that. For me, what was important was that we viewed the gods the way the people at the time might have viewed them. So they're seeing evidence of the gods in nature. They're seeking and finding gods and the influence of gods in the people around them. Odysseus says to Telemachus, 'Don't look for gods in men, you'll just be disappointed.' And some of what Odysseus says about divinity, to me, is somebody who's protesting a bit too much, somebody trying to live in denial of their own instincts and their own practices." So when it comes to what Nolan said in this interview, it seems as though he wants the audience to have their own interpretation of the things being shown. Like with the Athena reveal and the god's interpretation in his film, it can essentially be a reflection of how we have differing views. I really like the way Nolan approached this element because he could have just gone the conventional approach of having gods appear in the sky or over-the-top visualizations of those characters. But he decided to make it more meaningful to us in the real world and how specific signs that characters see through all the elements and nature make us question them. And again, the portrayal of Athena and Odysseus' guilt come the end of this film is at the very heart of that approach. Furthermore, Time also asked him about a few other things, like his portrayal of Helen of Troy in the movie, saying to him, "At different points in the film, if man is given the opportunity, he becomes a beast. A soldier will behead a priestess. You imply that Menelaus purposefully scarred Helen's face either because he believes she's responsible for the Trojan War or to prevent anyone from taking her again." Nolan answered this by saying, "That line, the face that launched 1,000 ships, or maybe just 500, just occurred to me to write. Sometimes what you do as a writer is purely instinctive. I felt that the poem didn't necessarily address what it is for Helen to be brought back by Menelaus and how that would ever work. How would that relationship be? How could it possibly be anything other than the most acidic, awful marriage? There's a lot of things that's happened in that relationship, and we have a very brief moment of time with them in this story. I was looking for a shorthand way to communicate the aftermath of the war and how it's been traumatic for the entire world. And then the last thing that was talked about was the speech by Samantha Morton's Circe. Time magazine said to him, "You also see this idea of man as beast in the scene with Circe. She said that Odysseus's men would have raped and killed her and that they're pigs. Then you get to the end and see the sack of Troy and the horror of what they did." Nolan replied to this saying, "Circe articulates it well in the film, and I love the way Samantha Morton has played that part." Talking about choices of adaptation, the end of the poem is so grim and so misogynistic that I had to exclude some of that material. But I didn't want to completely take it off the table in terms of what it is saying about men and the way they wage war. Now, it's true that Nolan's adaptation is actively critiquing the choices of Homer's characters and reshaping their actions to fit a modern, psychologically and morally interrogative style. I think he's done that because it works better as a modern large-scale adaptation of this story for the big screen. And by doing so, he's not necessarily changing the characters or the telling of the Odyssey's central journey, he's just adding to it. He isn't trying to reproduce Homer, he's trying to reinterpret him, and that's ultimately what a good adaptation can do. Especially for a work that is 3,000 years old and has been adapted many times and in so many different ways in different mediums. Homer's characters often act under divine influence or mythic inevitability, but Nolan prefers human motivation, moral consequence, and emotional realism. So he reshapes scenes to expose guilt, trauma, and responsibility. Mythic encounters like the siren scene or Circe's one have a greater sense of psychological confrontation to them. Divine interventions are trimmed or removed because Nolan wants the story grounded in human choice rather than gods deciding outcomes. Even structural changes in tightening parts of the story, altering pacing, or changing the ending reflect his desire to make the narrative more cinematic, coherent, and emotionally focused for a modern audience. So in short, Nolan changes Homer because he's not adapting the poem literally. He's adapting its meaning and reshaping the myth so it speaks to contemporary themes of guilt, memory, violence, and the cost of heroism. But that was my video discussing what Christopher Nolan has said on the ending and the changes he made to his adaptation of The Odyssey. What do you guys think towards the director's comments on the choices he made for the ending and some of the other elements of the film that he discussed? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section, alongside your opinion on how Nolan adapted the ending in his latest film. For much more videos and breakdowns, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like, rating, and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.